Okay, here we go. Well, welcome to the channel, and I have a very special guest with me today. Is Mr. Mal Hyman. He's the author of Burying the Lead, the Media and Assassination of President Kennedy. He serves as an associate professor of sociology at Coker College in South Carolina. He's currently the coordinator of the political science program. His past presentations included media and the assassination of President Kennedy, the media coverage of the assassination of JFK, which we're going to get into. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles, a master's degree from the University of California, Riverside. He's a distinguished educator, received the South Carolina Governor's Award in Excellence Teaching 1993, and he was named Coker College Master Professor of the Year in 92, 99, and 2012. He also received a Fulbright Scholarship to study in South Korea. And Mr. Hyman will be a featured speaker at the upcoming JFK Assassination Conference in Dallas next month, which I'm definitely going to be, I will definitely be there. Thank you for joining me today.
Join you.
Now, I want to start off by asking you, how did you get interested in the JFK assassination? Or you've been researching it for a long time. I think also want to mention about your course that you teach regarding the political assassinations. And I think you had a chance conversation with a student who introduced you to a congressman who was one of the on the committee for the assassination committee who reopened the case. That's kind of fascinating to me. And
it was to me too. I was surprised. I started teaching in the public schools and prisons, and I noticed whenever I talk about political assassinations in the United States, almost everybody was interested. So I kept reading on it, and I think by the time I started teaching college in 1987, I had let my colleagues know of my interest, and they encouraged me to set up a class on political assassinations. And I'd taken one at UCLA as an undergrad, and it was interesting, and I thought I could do it justice. And like I said, the first time I taught it, I had a student that knew Congressman Richardson Pryor, who headed the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And that was the reopening of the Warren Commission, because after Watergate, the FBI and CIA had lied so much the public was clamoring for a new investigation. And Geraldo Rivera actually showed the Zapruder film on ABC, Good Night America, and public saw it for the first time. And it's a stunner when you see it in slow motion and enhanced, and people are thinking, well, shots came from the front as well as the rear. That would make it a conspiracy. And Congressman Richardson Pryor from North Carolina had been a judge and a 6-term congressman. And a woman in class said, I'll be glad to introduce you. And he was a really nice guy. And we had a 2-hour conversation. And the political epiphany for me was at the very end. He said, my committee needed a lot more time and money. And the military destroyed their files. The CIA and FBI did not cooperate with our investigation. Keep up the good work, young man. And I didn't know what to say, other than I knew he didn't have to tell me that. We were in his office, and he honestly knew that it was a major conspiracy and a cover-up, and he was encouraging me to continue my exploration. And my angle had been the media, because keen interest in public opinion, and my dad had been a small town newspaper publisher. My brother and niece are broadcast journalists, so I wanted to look at how the media had covered it. And once I got started on that, I just stayed with it the best I could, and it took me 30 years to write the book. And of course, as soon as you finish the book, you realize people give you more information, and you need to revise it. So it's an ongoing investigation in an area of keen interest.
Yeah. What prompted you to write the book?
I thought it was necessary to take a lot of the chapters that had been written on the media and pull them together because it's a major part of the story. If the media were asking the questions that the general public asks, this would be front and center. We had our government overthrown. This was a coup d'etat.
Oh, yeah.
And essentially, the media drove the getaway car. They were the enabler on this. Perhaps they thought they were performing a public obligation. They were acting as public servants by not raising too many questions to make us look like a banana republic, or maybe what Johnson had told to Earl Warren to get him to serve on the Warren Commission. Something along this line, and this is phone conversation that's in the Johnson library. Johnson says to Warren, I'm ordering you as your commander-in-chief, put on your uniform, serve your country, and look into this. This could lead to 40 million dead and a world war. And reluctantly, Earl Warren headed the Warren Commission. And perhaps major mass media outlets were given a similar argument and initially covered things up at first. That was probably accelerated by the memo from Nicholas Katzenbach, the assistant attorney general at the time, who, after Oswald was killed by Ruby, put out a memo saying the public must be convinced that Oswald was the lone assassin and he didn't have Confederates. Well, I've always been interested in what the media can do and the sins of omission on what it doesn't do. So I thought that portion of the story needed to be told. And a lot of books have been written on the Kennedy assassination, and I thought I'm following the case closely, but other people have followed it more closely than me and for much longer than me. But I could make a contribution if I look at media coverage over a longitudinal study from the day of the assassination to contemporary times, while also including the basics on the case. So my book is a hybrid. It's my take on the case, woven together with how the media covered it and didn't cover it.
Didn't cover it. Yes. What do you think the purpose was for the media just to kind of maybe go to sleep on this and not really ask the tough questions they normally do? And I don't understand it.
It's tough to tell. Clearly, they were visited afterwards. Some of the major mass media outlets were visited by FBI people in order to make their stories appear that the shooter was from behind the president. We have that from the Dallas Times-Herald and the Dallas Morning News. And we have a Cold War cooperation between the mass media, particularly the major outlets, television and New York Times and Washington Post and Time Life and Newsweek. And that cooperation goes back to World War II, where it was the patriotic thing to do to speak with one voice in World War II, and then largely with one voice during the Cold War. And my sense is, and we can't prove this, it's all circumstantial, that they were prevailed upon, that Oswald, who had defected to the Soviet Union and then come back into the United States, could have been a Russian spy or could have worked with the Cubans. He was passing out fair play for Cuba literature. And that maybe, if the public demanded some response, this could lead to a world war, maybe in order to make us not look like a banana republic and not stampede the country into war at the time of a crisis. They would go slow, and they would wait until the Warren Commission finished its investigation, and then they would report on it. The media was not there for the investigation. Yet, the day that the 888-page report was released, CBS had a 2-hour special completely supporting the report and talk about speed reading on it.
Exactly.
Leaked copy. ABC had a 1-hour piece completely supporting the report. And in the major mainstream media, the New York Times, Washington Post, Time Magazine, there were kudos that talked about the report coming from experts, being in archaeological detail, and anyone that would question it was foolish or unpatriotic. The language was awfully strong. Now, to refresh the recollection of some of your listeners, the 888-page report didn't match the 26 volumes of hearings and exhibits that it was based on. And those hearings and exhibits didn't get released for another 2 months. Yet we got this strong support for the Warren Commission and its findings. And it's only when the public, led by people like Mark Lane and some intrepid journalists like Dorothy Kilgallen, were able to read through the report, that they started to see the contradictions and started raising questions, first in the alternative media and then occasionally in the mainstream media. By 1966, over half the public didn't trust the Warren Commission, and it led to increasing distrust of government. Approval and trust in government by mid-1963 was about 70%. But by 1968, trust in government, because of the political assassinations and the war in Vietnam, was close to 1 in 3. So this contributed to that distrust. And the media started asking some questions, but very, very late and very limited in their exploration. And I can only speculate on why they were so cautious, but I think it made us look like a banana republic during the Cold War. And I think at the outset, right after the assassination, there might well have been a significant concern that if the public demanded some sort of retribution for the communist, this Russian Cuban supporter, that it could, just a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, lead to a world war.
Exactly. Now, taking us back in time, we're going to be time traveling here, back in 1963, just the overall landscape, the mindset back then, height of the Cold War, people were pretty much fear of the Russians, maybe justifiable or not. And our foreign policy took on this kind of hawkish position, which certainly Kennedy was opposed to. You think all these set of circumstances maybe led to his assassination?
I do. I think Kennedy had less need to ask for money to run for the presidency. He's a very bright fellow, excellent speaker, good campaigner. He was able to be more independent by the time he got to the presidency. So there was really, I think he had done many things in his life, faced death in war with his own personal health. He was a philanderer. He wasn't, he certainly wasn't a saint. And I think what inspired him was to do the best by his country and bring about more justice. And he was horrified at the arms race, and as an Irish Catholic, horrified about the oppression of colonialism. He had heard the stories and had visited Vietnam in 1951, saw the French, and what was happening to them, the loss of resources, the suffering, the nature of hanging on to a colonial empire and what the costs were. And he was opposed to colonialism. And when he got into power, this ran directly in contravention to where the military, the CIA, big business, banking, and oil companies were. They thought we needed to expand the American empire as well as to stand up to the Soviets at every turn. And Kennedy was going to take the country a different direction, not only after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in '61, where he could see the CIA and the military for what they were, and I think suffered few illusions at that point. And just to make mention, he fired Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, the first time a president had ever fired the head of the CIA. And the Dulles family was one of the strongest families in America. In the 1950s, Allen Dulles had free reign at the CIA, and his brother, John Foster Dulles, was the Secretary of State. Eisenhower in 1960 one time said, and I quote from some books on this, that he was left with a legacy of ashes about the CIA. Kennedy decided he was going to rein in the CIA, and he fired Allen Dulles, General Cabell, and General Bissell that were in charge of the Bay of Pigs. And General Cabell's brother Earl was the mayor of Dallas in 1963, involved in setting up the motorcade route through Dallas. Okay. Kennedy, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, saw that the military wanted to confront the Soviets, and it would have led, most likely, to a nuclear war. And I think he was horrified. He could see where the military was going with their proposals for Operation Northwoods. I encourage your viewers to look that one up. But essentially, the military said we would be willing to blow up buildings and blame Castro so that you could justify an invasion of Cuba. And they gave other tactical possibilities. There could be a hijacked plane that's blamed on Castro's communists that would justify an invasion. Kennedy was horrified and said no. But he could see where the military was leading him. And I think most of the military, it's not that they were investing in, Cuban nickel or sugarcane. They honestly believed that it was necessary to stand up to the Soviet Union and communism during the Cold War. Kennedy could see where that could lead. So they philosophically were completely opposed. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy stopped all nuclear testing above ground, challenged the Soviets to stop nuclear testing, and then he moved toward a cessation of all nuclear testing below ground, and the military was horrified. So he had a lot of enemies in the military. But the list of enemies, as you know, goes much further than that, because he was prosecuting the mafia. This is the most extensive prosecutions that we've seen in American history, and Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General. John Kennedy felt that if we make peaceful change impossible, we make violent revolution inevitable. And he set up the Alliance for Progress in Latin America to support independent church groups that moved toward democracy in the region. In part, the lessons that Kennedy and his close advisors took from the Cuban situation was that if you don't allow democratic forces to flourish, you may end up with another Cuban revolution. So to forestall those possibilities and to make the change more peaceful and democratic, he started the Alliance for Progress. Well, the international business community and banking community were opposed to this because it was cutting into their profits and their control of Central and South America. But it goes further than that. Kennedy honestly believed that the non-aligned movement should be allowed to flourish. If countries like Indonesia, rich in resources, decided they wanted to develop their own resources and not align with the United States or with the Soviet Union or China, that they should be allowed to, that they should have the freedom of independence to develop themselves. This also led Kennedy into confrontations with elements of the business community. Kennedy believed that the oil companies should pay their fair share of taxes. And while Kennedy lowered the taxes on the very, very wealthy, he thought the oil companies should pay their fair share, and there certainly would be no CIA actions to overthrow countries like Iran in order to get access to cheap oil. And it I don't think was an accident that the assassination happened in Texas, a center of oil business and connections between oil barons and elements of the CIA. But it actually goes further than that, because Kennedy wanted to rein in the international banks. He actually wanted to have health care for everyone and was speaking to that effect, and strongly believed on his Western trip in 1963 that we needed to protect the air and the water. He was starting a war on poverty, where he held up poor white kids from Appalachia in order to touch the hearts and minds of the public. And Kennedy was likely to be reelected, and his brother was in the wings. I think he was a threat to many elements of those in power in the United States. And a lot of things changed after Kennedy was assassinated.
Right. How convinced are you that, talking about Oswald, that he was really not this lone nut, communist sympathizer, deranged individual, acted alone like the Warren Commission or government tried to lead us to believe? And do you think, when you speak about, do you think he was innocent?
He claimed till he was shot that he was a patsy, and there were no powder burns on his face.
Right.
And the police chief, Jesse Curry, wrote that in 1968, couldn't get a publisher for his book. Hardly anyone knows that that's what he said. And he thought shots might have come from the triple overpass, which would have been in front of the presidential limousine. And Chief Curry knew there were a lot of witnesses saying shots came from the front. I think we don't have witnesses that put Oswald up in the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, nor people that can place him as running down the steps immediately after the assassination. His sergeant in the Marine Corps said he was a lousy shot.
Right.
Why would anybody buy a lousy rifle and a cheap scope from a mail order company that would trace it to you? You go into any gun store.
If you really wanted to get caught, that's the way to do it.
Exactly. I mean, it doesn't pass the test of common sense.
No.
Also, no powder burns on his face from a Mannlicher Carcano rifle that was bolt action. Slow moving rifle. I mean, none of it really adds up. And Oswald's history is fascinating, and we're still waiting for files to be released 60 years later, that would round out the picture on Oswald. But he certainly appears, after being trained in Russian at El Toro Marine Base, that we were setting up somebody to be a fake defector. We stationed him at Atsugi base in the Philippines, or in Japan, where we were flying our U-2 spy flights from.
Right.
I mean, he had top secret clearances. And then when he decides to defect, he goes into the American embassy in Moscow and says he's going to renounce his U.S. citizenship and tell what he knows. And we didn't arrest him. Sounds like a fake defector to me. And when he comes back in the United States, a couple years later, marries a Russian bride, we didn't formally debrief him. And he's meeting with retired admirals and generals and colonels and people in the oil business and ardent anti-communists. While he's passing out fair play for Cuba literature out of Guy Bannister's office in New Orleans, who worked at a high level in the FBI, running the FBI office in Chicago, and involved with all sorts of right-wing organizations like the John Birch Society. And Oswald's working out of his office,
Right.
meeting with Clay Shaw, who we now know has ties to the CIA.
Yeah.
Now, we don't know who's pulling Oswald's string at the end. But I think it's fair to say that he has, as Senator Schweiker said, fingerprints of intelligence all over him.
I believe that. Right. We're running out of time, a few minutes left. Time has flown. Getting back to the media, I know, how essential do you think free press is in this country, society? How has the press been maybe compliant or complacent? I know we touched upon that a little bit. And just the makeup of just what kind of, how it evolved or digressed since the 60s, or as the media is concerned.
Fundamental to a democracy, if we can't get access to information, how can we make decent decisions? And the founding fathers knew that and put it in the First Amendment. And there's always been a struggle. It's hard to get access to good information if the media system is owned by millionaires and now billion-dollar conglomerates, with a cross-section of corporate America sitting on the board of directors, and the money-making operations being advertising, and it's mainly million and billion-dollar operations that are buying the ads. So there are a lot of filters on our news. There's always been a reluctance on national security issues for the public to get access to good information. And even issues like minimum wage rarely get covered, even on Labor Day. So we've got a lot of filters to our news. When Fox News got started in 1990s, it was more avowedly conservative Republican, and that's fine under our system, but we need to be aware of it. And they moved further and further to the right, so that when it came to even examining, let's say, what happened on January 6th, they were spreading a lie that had been debunked in the courts, and were misleading the public to a great extent. And they were willing to use some strategies that we saw in Germany in the 1930s. The big lie, constant attack. Instead of having adversaries, you demonize your adversary. They're now your enemy. They're the enemy of the people, the enemy of democracy. It polarizes the country, leaves us less able to figure out what's going on. Let me circle back to some of the other elements of the mainstream media that haven't followed this case, but they also haven't taken a good look at, how do we really get involved in the war in Iraq? Or what really happened in Afghanistan? Or why are there so many people that question what happened with 9/11? Or can you get into what really went on with the assassination of Martin Luther King? Or when new information comes out on the John Kennedy assassination, like it did with Paul Landis in his book,
Yes,
on some new bullet that apparently he claimed was found, and he put it on a stretcher and he didn't report it. Okay, this allows 60th anniversary a chance for us to re-examine the case. The articles are woefully inadequate. They don't include questions of chain of custody. They don't question the Secret Service the way they need to, in part because it's relatively complicated and you have to follow the case. And perhaps in part, they just want to grant that, yeah, maybe the critics were right, but we'll never know. And the coverage to this day not only leads to a greater distrust in government. I think this is critical at a time where people are hungry for the truth. It's harder to find it on the mainstream media. And also, if we're left with lingering, strong suspicions or knowledge that there was a conspiracy and a cover-up, then any demagogue can say there's a deep state and the press is the enemy of the people, and can weaponize those arguments because there is some truth to them.
Right. We're just about out of time. Mr. Mal, how do people get in touch with you? Where can they find your book that's been released? And
it's on Amazon, Burying the Lead. And, as soon as you finish it, you realize you'd like to revise it. And I'll update it some with my talk in Dallas in November. And a very humbling experience. But I think it's my contribution to democracy, and it's been a pleasure to talk about it.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you on, and I urge everyone to buy your book, and want to remind everyone that you'll be speaking at the conference next month in Dallas. And Mal Hyman, thank you so much. Great talking to you.
Thanks again, Randy. Appreciate it.